So in this series, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of photography, the basics. I often get asked, is this the best camera? Or what's the best camera? Or is this lens good for this? And these are great questions. But when you're beginning in photography, it's really important to understand the fundamentals first. And that's what the series is planning on covering. Photography is an art form. It's a great hobby. It can be a great career path. But like all art forms, it's subjective. What I think is great art maybe isn't great art to you, and vice versa. But unlike a lot of other art forms, photography is heavily weighted in both technology and theory. And in order to really achieve great art or great results from your photography, you really need to understand these fundamentals. So in this series, we'll be covering all of those. Things like the rule of thirds for composition, or the exposure triangle, how light interacts with your subject, how it interacts with your technology. We're going to talk about focal lengths, what camera bodies are good for what situations, what lenses are good for what situations, and a whole bunch of other stuff in between. So grab your camera, remember to hit the like button on the page and get those notifications coming, and come and join me as we learn the basics of photography. So without fail, the most common question I get asked is, which camera should I buy? And it's a great question. It's where we all have to start. You want to do photography, you're going to need a camera, obviously. But the answer as to which camera you should choose isn't quite so obvious. Let me explain. Okay. So you're looking to buy your first camera and you want to know which camera is going to be best for you. Look, there's several factors you really need to consider in choosing that first camera. And let's face it, we're spoiled for choice right now. There's so many different kinds of cameras on the market, from small compact point and shoots all the way to like full frame professional DSLRs and everything in between. They're so loaded with so many different kinds of options and technical specifications now that it can be completely overwhelming when you first start looking at it. Even after decades in the field of photography, it's overwhelming for me sometimes. But there are certain things that you should be looking at when choosing that first camera, and we're going to break those down for you now. So my first tip for you is about ergonomics. Go out, find some cameras, pick them up, and see which camera feels most comfortable to hold. There's so many different kinds of cameras on the market, and they're all a little bit different. Where the dials are laid out, the buttons are laid out, are all going to be completely different. And some will work better for you than others. So go out, find some cameras, and pick them up. I get asked quite often why I shoot Nikon over Canon, and that's the only reason. It's got nothing to do with image quality or loyalty to the company. It's simply that I like the way the Nikon feels when I'm using it. I like the way the dials are placed and the buttons are placed. It feels right when I'm carrying it. That's why I shoot that camera. So make sure you check out which camera feels right in your hand. Okay, so for most of you who are starting into photography, you'll probably look at an entry-level DSLR. These often come with a couple of kit lenses, something like a 18 to 55 and a 70 to 300mm lens. And these lenses are really useful for giving you like a broad coverage of different kinds of focal lengths you might need to use in photography. It's great when you're not exactly sure what kind of photography you want to do yet, and it gives you a chance to shoot a whole bunch of different kinds of things. Now, these aren't the greatest lenses out there, and if you stick with photography, you'll probably grow out of them very quickly. So think about that when you're looking to purchase that kit. Sometimes it's better just to buy the camera body and invest into lenses. You'll find over time that the cameras will come and go, but you'll keep your lenses for a much longer period of time. So keep that in mind and have a look at your different options out there. Okay, so as I said before, when it comes to choosing a camera, you really are spoiled for choice. There are so many different kinds of cameras available, from things like this, which is a workhorse, a 1 series. These are the cameras you'll see sports photographers using, war photographers using, because they shoot incredibly fast frame rates and they also are really robust and hard to damage. These are great cameras. They're very expensive, but just because they're the most expensive doesn't mean that they're great for every situation. You'll also find smaller bodied cameras like this. This is the Nikon D800 series, and this camera here has got incredible resolution. It's not very fast for shooting action shots. You can't get as many shots in a row in the burst mode, but when you shoot a landscape you can find all the details because it's got so much resolution. There are mirrorless cameras out there which are smaller and have much better form factor, which are great for traveling. There are point and shoot cameras now that can shoot RAW and give you all the options that you want to have to shoot amazing images but fit in your pocket. The choice as to which camera you're going to use really depends on the type of photography that you want to do. But ultimately, pretty much all the cameras on the market right now are capable of taking an amazing photo. Most of them take fantastic video as well. Choosing that camera will really come down to what it is that you require or what it is that you need. If you're just taking photos for, say, social media, then you don't really have to worry about getting a high resolution camera. If you're doing travel photography, then maybe you want something that's going to be smaller and more compact so it's not weighing down your bag. If you're into vlogging, then you're definitely going to want a camera that has an articulating screen so you'll be able to see yourself and frame yourself in the shots. These are the things that you need to look at and compare. And also remember to go out and check the camera itself, see how it feels. In the end, the photography will come down to your vision, to what you see and your art. The camera is just a tool. Happy shooting. Now, the exposure triangle sounds a little convoluted, but really it's quite simple. Essentially, it's 3 elements that once you understand how they work individually and together, you can really control your exposure and achieve the look you're after. Those 3 elements are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's break them down now. Okay, so first let's talk about aperture. Aperture essentially is the iris of your lens. It's that opening on the back of the lens that controls how much light can travel through the lens and to the sensor. When we shoot wide open, which is having that iris wide open, we allow a lot more light to travel through the lens in a short period of time. This also affects the depth of field of our shot, or where the focus is. Now, you may see this in portrait photography where they have that shallow depth of field where the background's all soft and dreamy, or bokeh as some people like to say. This is shot with a wide open lens or wide open aperture. Having your lens wide open is also fantastic for low light situations because you get more light traveling through the lens in a short period of time, which allows you to expose more correctly in darker situations. On the other hand, as we close down our aperture, we allow much less light to travel through the lens to the sensor. This has the opposite effect on our focus point, often giving us a much deeper depth of field. You'll see this in landscape photography in particular, where the foreground, mid, and background are all in focus. So next is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is fairly self-explanatory. Essentially, it's how fast we open and close the shutter or the curtain and how much light we allow to travel to the sensor. When we use a fast shutter speed, we freeze our action. You'll see this a lot in sports photography or action photography. On the other side of that is when we use a slow shutter speed. Anything that's moving during the time that the shutter is open will have that soft blur. And you might see this like when people are shooting those dreamy waterfall photos or seascapes. So next, let's talk about ISO. ISO essentially is the sensor's sensitivity to light. Now, as we increase the sensitivity of our sensor, say that 3 times real quick. Increase the sensitivity of our sensor, increase the sensitivity of our sensor, increase the sensitivity of our sensor. As we increase that sensitivity of the sensor, say 6400 or 12800, we allow ourselves to expose more correctly in low light situations. The flip side is that we start to introduce noise to our image. When we bring our ISO down to more of a native setting of, say, ISO 100, we're going to get a much clearer image. However, we need to extend either our shutter speed or open up our aperture to compensate for the amount of light that we're losing. So let's look at a few real-world examples of how we can use the exposure triangle in everyday situations. Let's start with a sports event at night. Now we're going to want to use a shallow depth of field to really separate our athlete from the background. We're also going to want to use a high shutter speed to really freeze the action and take away any kind of motion blur, which means that we have to compensate for those two elements by increasing our ISO. Okay, now what we're going to do is we want to do, say, a long exposure landscape shot. We've got a beautiful waterfall in front of us. We want to blur out our image and have some soft water flowing, so we're going to need motion blur, which means we have to slow down our shutter speed. As we slow down that shutter speed, we're going to be allowing a lot more light to come through on our image, so we're probably going to want to increase our aperture and decrease our ISO to compensate. So in a nutshell, that's the exposure triangle. It's really not that difficult when you think about it. Go out and try it with a few different situations and really begin to experiment with each of those elements and think about how they're affecting your image. Practice makes perfect, right? So it's been raining a lot, which has made it quite hard to get these videos done. But we've got a little gap in the weather, so let's just jump right into number 4. And number 4 is all about metering modes. Now, metering modes are an essential part of your photography. They're going to play a major role in how your workflow comes out, how you're out there shooting different events or different kinds of scenes. So they're very important to understand. They're not overly complicated, but at first they can be a little bit daunting to see. So let's break right into them. Now, I shoot Nikon, so I'm going to be discussing the Nikon names and icons. You'll find that these pretty much correlate across all the brands. They may be slightly different icons or slightly different names, but essentially you'll figure out which ones correlate with your camera brand. If you have trouble with that, drop a comment below and we'll see if we can help you out. But it's fairly easy to understand. Now let's start off with matrix metering. Now, matrix metering, which is this icon here, is essentially an overall meter of the entire scene. So the camera will look at your highlights and your shadows and your midtones, balance them all out, and give you an exposure reading based on all of those. Now this is probably the most closest you'll see that would be what your iPhone does or what a point and shoot camera does, an automatic camera does. They pretty much all use matrix metering mode to get the exposure right. Now you'll use this when you're doing things like big wide shots. For example, it's definitely going to be using matrix metering for landscape photography or just general wide shots where you want everything in the shot to be exposed correctly. You don't want to have things where they're super crushed blacks, where they're just super underexposed, or really blown out highlights where it's super overexposed. You want to have everything kind of exposed correctly so that you can play with it later. And for that, you'll be shooting with matrix metering mode. Now the next metering mode we have is called center weighted, which is this icon here. It looks like a dot with some parentheses around it. And what center weighted does is it looks at where you're focusing in your shot and grabs a little bit of the area around that focus point, and it does a light reading for that, or a light metering for that. This is really the one I use the least, but it's still very useful to have. You'll find this is really good for when you're doing like sort of portraits on locations and things like that, where you want to meter for your subject, but you also kind of want to keep a little bit of the background exposed correctly as well. So that's when you want to use center weighted the most in my experience. Now the one I use quite a lot in a lot of photography that I've done, especially event and bridal photography, is the next one, and that is spot metering, which is that icon there. Now spot metering does exactly that. It only meters on the point that you're focusing on. It just takes a spot reading. This is really useful when you're shooting something that is heavily backlit, I've found. A lot of times with bridal photography, I'm trying to shoot the bride and groom who are standing in front of a large window, heavily lit from the behind, so heavily backlit, and metering for their faces is very important because I want their faces to be exposed even at the expense of the background being overexposed. So in these times, I'll use spot metering and meter directly for their faces. The metering mode that you're using really affects you more and more if you're not shooting directly in manual mode. So for example, if you're shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority, or you're using auto ISO, you're allowing the camera to control the exposure based on the metering it's taking. So you really have to consider that when you're setting your camera up. What metering mode are you in? What situation are you shooting? And do you have one of those settings switched on? If so, then it's very, very crucial. Otherwise, you can end up with some very underexposed images or some very overexposed images, and that can be a nightmare to fix later. Okay guys, that's basically metering mode in a nutshell. It's, like I said, it's not such a difficult thing to understand, but it can look a little daunting at first. Today we are going to discuss a few settings on your camera. I'm going to combine two sort of large sections that really don't need an in-depth video on each of them, so we're going to combine those two today. We're going to be looking at the shooting modes on your camera and also on your autofocus modes. Now let's start with talking about the shooting modes. So I'm going to just focus on the three main shooting modes which we will find across the board on pretty much all cameras. I'm not going to worry about the sort of like smaller bonus features that come with the different makers. So those three modes are your S mode, your A mode, and your M mode. Now that stands for shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. Now shutter priority basically is where you set the shutter speed of your camera and allow the camera to choose your aperture and your ISO to complete your exposure triangle. This is really useful when you're shooting, say, something that's a little bit more of a fast-paced or a hectic event. Live news actions, things that are breaking and moving fast, sporting events where things are moving very quickly. This mode will allow you to set your shutter speed, whether you want to have a high shutter speed so you can freeze action, or a slower shutter speed for like more blurry shots, or like different kinds of effects. But you set the shutter speed and allow the camera to focus on everything else, so that you're free to just focus your subject and compose your subjects and not worry too much about changing lighting and all those various other things that go on when you're shooting an event. Aperture priority is where you control the aperture. So you tell the camera what you want your aperture to be, and it'll choose your shutter speed and your ISO. I find that I use this mostly when I'm shooting something where I need to control my depth of field. I want a consistent depth of field throughout the shot, but I don't necessarily want to worry about my shutter speed. For me personally, I use this sometimes when I'm doing time-lapse photography. These modes, again, are useful, but I tend to stay in the next mode, which is manual mode. Now, manual mode is exactly that. It's where you control all the functions of your camera. You set the shutter speed, you set the aperture, and you set the ISO. That's what manual mode is. And this is the mode you really should be shooting in the most if you want to improve your photography, because this is the mode that's going to keep you focused on what you're doing, focused on what's happening in your shot, and really thinking about what your camera needs to be adjusting in order to capture that image that you're looking for. It's just a constant training of photography, and definitely if you have the option to shoot in manual mode, then just stay in manual mode. I tend not to use shutter priority or aperture priority very much at all. In general, it's maybe once or twice a year I might switch to those modes. A lot of times it's usually if I'm just feeling a bit lazy as well, I might throw it in there as well, or if I'm having a bit of an off day. But in general, I stay in manual mode. Okay, so those are the basic shooting modes of your camera. You will find that there are the other gimmicks that get thrown in by your camera manufacturer. Usually those will be the P mode, often jokingly called the professional mode, but it stands for program. So it's all preset. It's just where the camera has a bunch of settings, whether it be for low light or it be for portraiture, where the camera will automatically adjust your settings to give you that kind of look. That's really useful if you're a hobbyist. So those modes are there. I'm not going to discuss them. You can figure them out yourself. Now we'll move on now to your autofocus modes. Now I shoot Nikon, so this is going to be really focused on how Nikon present those modes. Other manufacturers will have different ways of doing it, but I'm going to focus on the Nikon ones. Now the two basic modes that you'll find, apart from your manual mode, is your AFS and your AFC. Now AFS is single servo mode. And basically what that is that you will use your focal point within your viewfinder and set it on your subject, and in that you'll have to press your shutter or back button, whichever one you choose, and you'll grab your focus. After that, you're free to either recompose or just take your shot. So single servo basically will focus until it has the focus locked. Once it's locked focus, it stops trying to adjust that focus. This is really good for portraiture. This is really good for still life. This is good for things that aren't moving, things that are very predictable. Your subjects that are staying still, if you're shooting in like a studio environment, or if you're shooting someone who's seated, or you're shooting, like I said, still life, things that aren't moving, things like macro photography can be, single servo mode can be fantastic for these. You wouldn't use single servo mode so much for, say, if you're trying to capture a sports action. You can do, but it's not probably the best mode for that. The best mode for that kind of shooting is the next mode, which is AFC. Now, AFC stands for autofocus continuous. So whatever is present within your focus point, the camera will continually adjust the focus to hold focus on that subject. So if you lock your focus in and you've got your focus point pressed over someone and you keep following them as they move, whatever is within that focus point will stay in focus and the camera will constantly adjust. That's AFC. So this, again, this is good for when you have subjects that are moving. I use this a lot when I'm shooting, family portraits where I have people interacting and moving around within the scene. I'll use this when I'm shooting sporting. I use this when I'm shooting wildlife. This is the mode that I'm going to use when I really want to maintain my focus on a moving subject. Now, within those two modes, you'll find other modes. And this is where it starts to get interesting. So, for example, you can find a group setting. Now, a group setting is where instead of having a single focus point, you'll have 4 focal points. And the camera will basically hold focus on what is within those four points. It'll try to find whatever is in that area and hold focus on that group. This is great when you're shooting something that's slightly more present within your frame. Like, say you're shooting a car that's doing a drift, you might use that grouping mode so that you can hold focus a little bit better. Whereas if you were using a single point focus, it may slip a little bit easier. This just gives the camera a little bit of a wider area to find that focus. Another great mode in there is 3D. 3D is where the actual focus point will shift to try to track and follow whatever subject was inside that focal point when you began setting your focus. And that's really good when you've got something that's moving erratically. I tend to use the 3D focus when I want to follow a subject, but I'm also moving. And that way I can just focus on keeping my composition the way I want it to look and allow the camera to track the subject and keep them in focus. Even if I slip a little bit with my composition, or I'm not, they've moved suddenly, they're still in focus within the frame and I can deal with that later. That's where the 3D mode is fantastic. When it comes to your autofocus modes, there's no real hard set rule. For example, let's say we're shooting sporting, and in general with sports, you've got, say, a rugby team or a soccer team, and you've got a player running down the field, and you would most likely have your camera in AFC so you can track that player as they move, and you're following them. But as you're following them, another player comes between you and them just for a moment. They can actually take your focus. So the camera may shift its focus onto that other player there, and you can lose the shot. So sometimes in that situation, you might want to be either in a manual focus, or you may want to be in AFS focus, where you're just constantly grabbing your focus on your subject. So there's no hard, fast rules, but just understanding how these different focus modes work and then applying them to different situations is really an important part of your photography. So the best advice when it comes to your focus modes is just to go out and play around with them, try them in different situations, and find out what works best for you. Some people just prefer to shoot in AFS. Some people prefer to shoot in AFC. Some people love manual focus. It really depends on the shooter, how your workflow is, and what you're shooting. So get out there, experiment around with those different autofocus modes, and figure out what's going to work best for what situations. Practice makes perfect, right?
Okay, so now this video we're going to talk a little bit about composition. Composition is a very broad subject, and it's really open to interpretation by the viewer and by the artists themselves. But there are some basic and fundamental rules to take a look at and get familiar with, and then break the hell out of them in order to make your shots your own. And we're going to start with looking at the rule of thirds. So basically, with the rule of thirds, you divide the image or the frame into thirds, both vertically and horizontally. And by placing your subject or certain aspects of your image on these axes, you can really enhance the whole viewing experience of the image, the impact of the image. But the best way to explain this is to show you through examples. So when you have your subject in the frame, you will want to keep your subject either on this third axis or on that third axis. And how you choose that is dependent upon where the subject is looking. So for example, you don't want to have your subject looking towards the edge of the frame. You want them to be looking to the wider area of the frame. This creates a sense of space and gives a little bit more interest in the image because you're wondering, what is the subject looking at? Much like I'm framed in this video now, if I was simply to turn myself and face to this way while talking to you, it would feel very condensed, very, very small. It feels very claustrophobic almost. But by turning and facing this way, I open myself up and also you to what is here in this empty space. And it creates a more pleasing image. Another example of how to use this is with landscape photography. One thing that is considered a mistake with landscape photography is when the horizon is placed dead in the center of the frame. A lot of people believe that you should keep your horizon at the top of the frame or the bottom of the frame, and it creates a much more pleasing image when you do this. It's not always the case, but in most cases it does look a lot better. Okay, now I'm going to show you a few examples and have the subject both center framed and then placed out into one of the three axes of this grid, and just show you the difference in impact that it does make. It's subtle in some cases, but it does create a difference. Another place where you can really use the rule of thirds is when you're framing a close-up of someone's face. In general, you would want to keep their eye line in the top frame, in the top 1/3 of the image. Even if they're centered in the frame, you still want to have that top 1/3 across the eye line. It just creates a much more dramatic image. It allows your viewer to really focus in on the eyes. Okay, so there are no real hard and fast rules when it comes to composition, in my personal opinion. I think that we can all find images that are pleasing to us, and that's really the essence of photography. So when it comes to working on your composition, one thing that's good to know is these fundamental rules, like the rule of third, but also to go out there and just try a bunch of different frames within the same shot. I've often seen photographers shooting frame after frame without really moving or adjusting their camera, just slightly changing settings. To me, this is such a waste of time. When you feel like you've captured an image in a certain frame, adjust your frame. You can still shoot the same image, but just change the way you're composing that shot. Shoot a whole bunch of different compositions, and then when you get back into the computer, you can find the ones that you really like and figure out what it is about that image that really stands out to you. What did you change when you recomposed that image that made it better than the last composition? Work on creating your own style, because composition is key. This is just a basic run over of composition. In later tutorials, I'll be talking with more advanced, specific lessons based on a certain type of photography. We're going to delve into landscape photography and really look at composition and how it affects landscape photography. We're going to look at portraiture and really focus on how you can compose your photos for portrait photography to create an image, to create a feeling. Another thing to consider when composing shots is negative space. You see this a lot in portrait photography. Negative space essentially is the area that has no real point of focus in it, your subject is not using. A lot of times you'll see people framing shots where there's a lot of headroom above the subject. To give you an example, I'll just crouch down for a moment. It creates a sense of someone being quite small and not very important in the frame. It also detracts from the user so that your eyes are not pulled to focus on that subject. Whereas when you have the frame cutting more across the head here like this, you create a sense of it being full and impactful frame. What you're seeing in the frame is more important and needs to have your attention, have the viewer's focus. With composition as well, it comes down to more than just how the image is framed, but also how the camera is positioned. By shooting from a low angle, you can create a sense of power or authority within your subject. Shooting from a high angle can have the adverse effect of creating someone that feels small or diminished. By simply changing the angle or the height of your camera, you can really create a different experience for the viewer. By bringing the camera down to a very low level, You're showing people a scene that they may be seeing on a daily basis, but from an angle that they maybe haven't looked at before. And also taking the camera much higher, turning the camera slightly on its axis. These are all different techniques you can use to take something that we see on a day-to-day basis and compose it in a way that is unusual, interesting, or different. And that creates impact. When it comes to composition, be creative. Find out what looks good. Play around. Enjoy yourself. And most importantly, happy shooting. Okay, thanks for watching. That concludes our fundamentals course in photography for beginners. From here on out, we're going to take more deep dives into specific genres of photography. Our next video series will be on landscape photography. So please subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so that you'll get notified when the next video drops. But most importantly, happy shooting.